Oath and the Office podcast starring Professor Corey Brettschneider. I'm John Fugelsang, and I am always so pleased to work with the author of The Oath and the Office and the Presidents of the People, Ivy League professor and disco superstar Corey Brettschneider. Professor, short intro today, but we have a lot to cover. Welcome. How are you, sir?
Thanks so much. I wish I was a disco superstar. I'm a huge fan of disco music and a terrible disco dancer, but dare to dream. I mean, I have to say at top, it is a special day, not just because we're going to be talking about the assault on our democracy and the use of the military and a horrible victory on the behalf of the Trump administration, but I have to congratulate you from the beginning, John. Of course, we'll have part two of our discussion and interview about separation of church and hate, your amazing book that has its birthday today and has just launched. And as you know, I'm anxiously, like any author, watching your numbers grow on Amazon, and it looks just phenomenal.
Yeah, I don't understand this world, Professor. You're a real author. I'm just a guy who talked my way into a book deal. I depend on you to let me know how I'm doing competing with Charlie Kirk on Amazon. I need to know.
So that is a great way to look at it, because unfortunately so many of the top sellers in books, as in media generally, are right-wingers, and your book is an antidote to that, a defense of progressive values, liberal in the sense of liberal democracy, and its compatibility with Christianity, and what a needed idea it is. And I can't wait to talk to you about it, and it is selling well. The American public is already responding, so congrats.
Well, I'm happy to talk about it, Professor, but obviously there's a lot we got to get to. I mean, Trump wants to send troops after American cities. He wants to fire people he can't fire. Epstein's birthday card is really real. And of course, let's begin with this. The Supreme Court, in its infinite racism, just ruled 6-3 that Donald Trump can restart his immigration raids in Los Angeles, even if they're based on nothing but race or language. Now, 20 million residents in LA, nearly half Latino, are now fair game. ICE agents can roll up on you because you spoke Spanish at a taco truck. This is not immigration enforcement. This is white nationalism with a badge. Corey, the Supreme Court just legalized racial profiling. Jim Crow got a seat upgrade to first class. And I'm thinking about the future history books, Professor, when they look back on this time and say, in 2025, the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional to consider race to helping a Latino student get into college, but totally awesome to consider race when throwing his dad into a concentration camp. I'm dying to know your thoughts. Justice Sotomayor said this was a shredding of constitutional protections. What does this ruling mean for equal protection and the due process rights in practice?
I think that's just such a insightful, I mean, a funny way, but also a brilliant way at the same time of talking about what's happening, because we really have nothing less than the shredding of the Equal Protection Clause, one of the main guarantees of liberal democracy. I also love the frame that you gave, and so I want to stick with that. What's it going to look like to historians of the future when they look back on this decision? And unfortunately, I do think it's a pivotal point in American history that historians will have strong opinions about. And I think it's the moment where we really see the Supreme Court as not being a court at all. Courts of law are supposed to act consistently. Now, the Supreme Court has differed about what the principles are, but within a range of things that are reasonable. So this Supreme Court has a view of the idea of equal protection, which is enshrined in the 14th Amendment. After the Civil War, that clause is inserted to make it clear that regardless of race, we're all equals. Now, how do you understand that? Do you understand it as opposition to racial subordination and the system of slavery? Or do you understand it, as the modern Supreme Court has claimed, as quote unquote colorblind? Let's just go with their idea just for a second, because I really
they're so colorblind. Yes, go on, please.
That's what they've said. So their view is the Equal Protection Clause. The modern conservatives say the Equal Protection Clause says don't take race into account, be literally blind to it. So in the Harvard case and the related UNC case, they said no affirmative action. Affirmative action takes race into account. It's not colorblind. Now look at this ridiculous decision, and you started to lay this out. It essentially says, yeah, you can take race into account when you're racially profiling. It can't be the only thing that you do. This is what Kavanaugh says. This is a shadow docket case, I should say. So we don't know the full court's opinion. We know Kavanaugh's view of it, which is possibly the majority's opinion. And he says, well, race can be an indicator of whether or not you're in the country illegally, especially when it's in combination with things like geography and whether you're at Home Depot. So just let me say the blunt thing. There's no principled justification at all for allowing racial profiling. He just undid a lower court's decision that said the simple thing, which is no, you can't uh, discriminate against people based on whether they're brown. And yet
Right?
he's saying, yeah, you can. And that is not colorblind. That is not anti-subordination. It's not it's essentially abandoning what we fought the Civil War about, the Equal Protection Clause.
I
Sorry
mean,
if
but
that
this
was
is
long, but this is a
no.
pivotal moment.
But this is what Joe Arpaio went to jail for. Corey, I've been in that man's jail. I did a show there with Bill Maher, and he was rounding up brown people if they look Latino, and we'll do the paperwork later and find out. And he was convicted of it, and of course, Donald Trump pardoned him. And you're right. These right-wing white politicians, they have to say colorblind because they don't ever want to be color conscious. That would require awareness and empathy, and maybe them not being on top all the time. And they'll be fine being colorblind when they're still the minority. Let's go to 2046 when white people are a minority in this country. You won't be hearing that. But the concurrence was written by your hero and mine, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who was qualified to be on the court because he liked beer and wept. He literally wrote that ethnicity can be a relevant factor for agents to stop somebody. Boy, that sounds a lot like running a Japanese internment camp. He also said the government is using geography, not race, to justify these raids. I guess Rosa Parks was sitting in the wrong geography of the bus that one time. But I mean, can you break down this legal argument and explain why critics see this as disingenuous or even dangerous?
First thing to say is there was a district court judge that looked into this extensively, and what was found was that ICE. By the way, these aren't short stops. They're literally rounding people up, masked men, throwing people in vans and taking them away. And we don't know, who these people are. And what was found after the court's investigation is that there was racial profiling going on. That the thing they were using to round people up was nothing less than the color of their skin. Now, that's supposed to be prohibited under our Constitution's Equal Protection Clause. And so, what this judge said was put a stop to this. It wasn't a final decision, but it was enough to stop these raids and to stop the techniques that were being used by ICE in these cases. Now, the courts come along, and I'll just remind listeners who haven't heard us use this phrase. Sometimes when the court doesn't want to give a full accounting of what they're doing, they don't want the American people or other lawyers or judges to see what they're up to. They use this technique that's become known as the shadow docket, emergency orders, where they don't give a full accounting of what they're up to. Now, the justices have the ability to not write a majority opinion. The court's views are really silent, but to say what they think. And Kavanaugh felt so strongly that the part of the opinion that was calling out racial profiling was wrong on behalf of this lower court judge,
Uh-huh.
that he jumped right in there and was like, no, that's
Oh, yeah.
okay. He's clearly trying to legalize
Yeah.
nothing less than racial discrimination, the very thing
Yes.
the Equal Protection Clause prohibits. So this whole lie that Kavanaugh cared about the text or that he was colorblind, none of that is true. He is one of the worst. And I'm now starting to have less regard for him than Clarence Thomas, and that's saying something. That he really is an authoritarian who is trying to throw power into the hands of this president. I oppose Kavanaugh's nomination. He was asked about a piece I wrote in Politico called Kavanaugh's Radical View of Executive
I
Power.
remember.
And I
Hmm.
was saying all of this, that this guy is just an authoritarian, and if you give him a robe, he's gonna undo all of the constraints on the executive branch and on a president, especially if it's somebody on his side. And wow, I mean, I wouldn't have even had this on my bingo card. I knew that he was going to undo many of the checks, but to undo the core protection of equal protection that, of course, bans rounding somebody up, seizing
Yeah.
them because of the color of their skin. It's to go back to our theme. Future historians looking back on this are going to see it as the moment where we shouldn't have high regard for the court. We lost any
I know.
semblance that this was a court of law. And there really is no, to give the bottom line difference between Justice Kavanaugh and Marjorie Taylor Greene. They're just
Oh,
awful politicians who are acting on their bias. And, maybe Kavanaugh
yeah.
has a slightly better education, but
I
that's
mean, I don't know. Who's hurt the country more? Kavanaugh even he admitted that American citizens are going to get wrongly detained and cuffed and locked up. But hey, they'll be free to go after this brief encounter. That's really comforting. Nothing screams constitutional rights, Professor. Like, don't worry, you'll only be unlawfully kidnapped and caged by the state based on the color of your skin for a few hours. I mean, the most outrageous thing about this, Corey, is a sentence I need to ask you about before I can move on. Um, the court's brief order was unsigned and gave no reasons.
Well,
Holy
that's
crap, what does that mean when they won't sign such a racist piece of filth that will bring shame in the history books? They wouldn't sign it.
Well, that's the shadow docket, and we've been talking about this
Yeah,
thing, and it was a law professor named Will Bode who gets the credit for noticing this. I actually don't think it would have been on journalists or academics' radar if he hadn't started to see, like, increasingly this weird procedures being used of emergency orders. And the assumption, I think, before he really discovered it was that these emergency orders were being used for things that weren't that important, weren't significant changes to the law. And who cares? And then he starts saying, well, what is in this? And he's like, it looks like this is some important stuff. And now not only is it important, it's the undoing of the equal protection clause. And you know
that's
what?
right.
That idea that this is a Marjorie Taylor Greene style political wing of the government rather than some highfalutin principled body really comes out, because if you want to act in terms of raw power and raw politics, hide your reasons. And that's exactly what the shadow docket does, these emergency orders. And so when it says that's what it's essentially telling us. Oh, we're using this horrible procedure where we're not going to even tell you why we're doing what we're doing. Now, I don't know if it's better or worse, but Kavanaugh felt the need to speak up about the reasons. And yeah, I think it's in some ways worse than you would have imagined, because he just comes out and says, yeah, racial profiling is okay. Just to be clear, and this isn't a defense of him, but I just want to say what his view is. It can't be the only thing, but you can use it in combinations with other things
Right.
like the location of individuals. But it is still what it is. It is not racial profiling, doesn't get to it. It is racial discrimination in order to deprive people of liberty. And don't let me miss your main point too, which is he talks about it as a kind of brief detention. And
That's
that's
right.
what's going on here at all. Anybody who's seen the videos of ICE grabbing people and throwing them in vans, this is the exact kind of thing that the framers they're turning over in their graves about this opinion,
That's
because
right.
it was all a worry about unlawful detention. If you look in the Constitution and then in the Bill of Rights, again and again, that's the thing they're worried about. And here we go, and we're doing exactly what they feared.
Well, listen, I don't want to judge Judge Kavanaugh too harshly because I like to have compassion for aristocratic racist drunks. Corey, in the midst of all this, Trump is threatening to send federal troops into Chicago. We talked about how Judge Breyer blocked that move. Can you walk us through the legal reasoning behind Judge Breyer's ruling? And are there any constitutional limits that still exist on a president's ability to move the military around like props into U.S. cities?
I should say, the founders were all concerned about a standing army in particular. And in fact, some of them, the anti-federalists, were so concerned about a standing army for a very specific kind of fear. The fear, and this led them to say, do not ratify the Constitution. These are people like Patrick Henry, the revolutionary hero turned opponent of the Constitution, a writer who goes by the name Brutus, and likely a New York judge or legislature. There's some debate about who he was, but he was a New Yorker who really understood the principles of law and a constitution. And what these anti-federalists said was, if you ratify this constitution, we're going to wind up with there was no standing army at the time, but we're going to wind up with a standing army. And what's wrong with that? It seems like the way to protect American security. No, they said, that standing army is going to be used to deprive people of any basic rights that we think that they have. So you can put on parchment, paper, all the rights you want. If you have a standing army, they're going to take over. Now that threat is really here in real time. And there's good news and bad news. The good news is Judge Breyer, Justice Breyer's brother, as we talked about last time, looked back to a law that actually itself has a horrible origin. Really, it was a law born in opposition to the idea that the federal government might use to protect civil rights after the
Right.
Civil War in the 19th century, the Posse Comitatus Act. But he's basically like, let's take what we can get, because there is this deep constitutional worry about using the army as police. And he says Posse Comitatus prohibits the use of the military for policing. And then he goes on to say, actually, the Constitution answered the anti-federalist worry And it did so in this deep way by giving states the powers of policing, not the federal government. So those two things, the posse comitatus and the idea of local government, it's a brilliant opinion. It's a right opinion. But now, as he moves into Chicago, is that going to be the opinion? We're going to have a new federal judge, maybe
Hmm.
a crony of Donald Trump, somebody who's trying to kiss up to him. What's the word that I'm looking for? Crony, flacky,
Henchman, flunky,
henchman,
hanger-on,
flunky.
winged
That's
monkey.
what I was looking. I was
Yeah.
looking for flunky.
Minion. I can do this all day.
I knew you were the person to ask. And the judge, despite the brilliance and importance, and again, I can't stress this enough, the rightness of and righteousness of Judge Breyer's opinion, we might get something very different. And now here's one technique that we have to worry about. The administration has a different law that they haven't used that they could use called the Insurrection Act. And the
Right.
Insurrection Act is an exception to posse comitatus. It was used by Eisenhower in Little Rock, for instance, to enforce civil rights judgment by a federal court. And if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act and has Hegseth Act based on it, I could certainly imagine even a moderate judge saying, well, despite these arguments that Judge Breyer gave about posse comitatus, about the 10th Amendment, the Insurrection Act trumps. It's an exception to those limits on the military. Now, they shouldn't say that because there's no insurrection. There's no failure to enforce the laws the way the
Right.
Insurrection Act requires. But it does, I mean, here's the scary part. It gives the president the ability to override the decisions and opinions of local officials, including governors. So, this is a fraught and scary moment. I'm not going to hide from it.
Okay, before we got to take a break, but let me ask one last scary question. Given the court's recent deference to Trump in almost every other case, how confident can we be that this will hold up if it reaches the Dirty Six?
Wow, after that shadow docket opinion that says something that even 2 days ago, if you would have said the Supreme Court's going to have an opinion that essentially okays racial discrimination, I don't want to call it racial profiling. It's not just profiling, it's seizing
Correct.
people and throwing them in vans,
Thank you. Profiling is
using
the
the
word the
color.
racists use to make them feel better. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
kidnapping.
using the colors. I wouldn't have believed it. So, I find it even more plausible that yes, the Supreme Court, especially if he uses the Insurrection Act, will uphold the use of the military for policing domestically. I'm sorry to say it, but that's the case. That's why I did some work talking to congressional staffers about the absolute need to amend that Insurrection Act to make it clear it can't be used for local policing. It can't be used to shut down protests. It can only be used in actual emergencies or in actual insurrections. And it just didn't get anywhere. There was some talk of that, but I think we missed a huge opportunity during the Biden administration to correct many of the constitutional and legal flaws that are allowing this assault on power. Well, let's call it what it is. I've talked about soft coup and the way that the other branches have been undermined, but let's not make any mistake. I've called this part, the use of the military, the hard coup, and that is exactly what it is.
Well, Corey, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is when we come back from the break, we're going to talk a bit more about Epstein files. The bad news is it just got creepier than we ever imagined. We'll be right back in just a moment. This is The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang, joined by Professor Corey Brettschneider. Professor, I know that you studied the law and became a constitutional scholar because you couldn't wait to talk about dead pedophiles and the living politicians protecting them. But we just found out that Trump did, in fact, send Jeffrey Epstein a birthday card. For years, Trump and his bootleggers, they've been swearing, no, it's all a hoax. And Trump's saying the letter doesn't exist. J.D. Vance used a profanity to describe it. Mike Johnson went so far as to invent ridiculous fan fiction that Trump was actually an FBI informant infiltrating Epstein's pedophile ring, which is funny for many legal reasons I want to ask you about. But I mean, apparently Trump was deep undercover. So deep undercover, Corey. His cover story was, we're best friends who exchange birthday cards. It was really subtle. And in the card, Trump thanked Epstein for the wonderful secret they shared. That's exhibit A more than anything. I mean, when Trump says wonderful secret, it's never like that time we cured polio or that time we worked at the soup kitchen. It's something we got to bleach our brains after reading. But for years, we've heard it's all a hoax, right? Now that it's all confirmed and we're getting more physical evidence, and again, Rupert Murdoch is driving a lot of this. How does this level of flat out lying, from J.D. Vance calling it complete BS to Mike Johnson spinning this FBI nonsense, How does it all fit into this broader pattern of government disinformation?
On the one hand, it's not a surprise. Those of us who followed Trump closely, as the two of us have for years, know that he was good friends with Epstein, that he called him at some point some variation of a terrific guy, that there's video of the two of them often together. And so the idea that he would have sent him something on his birthday card as awful as this is not a surprise. It really is consistent with everything that we've known. But so many of those in the MAGA movement and his supporters who put so much on the idea that Epstein was the sort of core of a criminal vast conspiracy that included, in their minds, mostly members of the Democratic Party, and that they were, committing a wide slew of crimes. Now,
Right.
that's collided with reality, which is that this guy was Trump's great friend. And what I'm hoping is, as important as the Epstein story is, and as awful as Trump is, and I mean, let's just, put it together. This is a sex trafficker, somebody who was
Thank you.
involved in abusing minors, and the worst kind of criminal. And Ghislaine Maxwell, his associate, also a friend of Trump's,
That's right.
also part of that and convicted. So on its own, it's an important story. But the key, I think, for us as we talk about it is to use it as an introduction to those who really were ignorant, I think, of how much this is a criminal presidency and a criminal president, and to use it as an introduction to his wider crimes. Because I think once you crack the reality bubble in regard to Epstein, you can start to do it with other crimes, including, of course,
Yes.
I think the most serious, which is the attempt on January 6th to destroy our democracy.
Well, the lies are getting more and more absurd. I mean, the White House is saying that this card is a forgery because I guess, Professor, 20 years ago, somebody said, "Hey, maybe someday that stupid racist landlord celebrity might be president, so I better fake him a birthday card for Jeff Epstein before Jeff Epstein gets in trouble." That's literally the argument. 20 years ago, before Epstein even got busted, someone planned this to hurt Trump because they knew the reality show landlord would be president someday. And then you got the Speaker of the House telling
Right.
this ridiculous lie that Trump was an FBI informant infiltrating Epstein's circle. Even the loyalists admitted this was absurd. Beyond what this means for democracy, when the second in line to the presidency is trafficking in lies this ridiculous, and let's be honest, if Speaker Pelosi had put forth a lie like this, we'd never hear the end of it until she was out of Congress. This will be forgotten by the end of the week. But here's my real question. What's the germ behind this idea? Because let's say that it was true. Donald Trump was an informant for the FBI to take down Epstein. That would generally indicate that the FBI had something on Trump and he wore a wire to get out of jail, right? Right?
Well, I think in MAGA world, it's kind of part of the same story. What you're seeing, I think, in all these cases is how deep did the network of lies have to be that they didn't know about this? That a significant portion of the country is consuming such different media. Frankly, they're not listening to the oath in the offices. Maybe we have a couple of former MAGA people who are listening. If you are listening, welcome on board. Leave a review. And we're glad to have you. But the
If
reality,
we let's like advertise this as an ultimate fighting show, and maybe some Trump supporters will listen in.
that the reality is that we live in a media environment that is so fragmented. Although people sometimes say it's unprecedented, it's not. We've had periods of time before in the 1790s when you have these two sets of realities, these two newspapers, one Federalist, one Democratic Republican, and now, of course, we also live in not just a fragmented but a divided media universe that has these two things. So part of the fascination to me is that MAGA is first learning about this, that we're seeping through the
Uh-huh.
information barrier. But the second thing I think that is really interesting to see, which is in your question, is the way that that information barrier, the guardians of it, are trying to put the shield back up. And when you see the Speaker of the House saying this just lunatic stuff about how he was an FBI informant, he was in on it, and all this, nonsense, that's all the kind of QAnon remnants of trying to
Oh,
put that wall back up. So
Oh,
it
he's
makes perfect sense in one sense that they're trying to undo the shattering of reality that I do think is happening. That's the real story here. Not that Trump was in league with Epstein. We knew that. What's happening is that the MAGA base is learning about it and trying to fight back and to resurrect that wall again.
so look, I don't want to badmouth the Speaker of the House, Corey. I love our deeply Christian, thou shalt bear false witness, Mike Johnson. The guy can't stop lying, but this is an entire ecosystem of powerful figures who want to bury the truth about child sex trafficking. And it's going to be harder to keep the right wingers dumb about this or just distracted by trans kids wanting the swim team. You have written so much, Professor, about how constitutional democracy depends on accountability. And this goes way beyond gossip at this point. What does it say about our institutions when a president and his allies in Congress can openly distort objective reality to shield themselves from scrutiny on something as serious as child rape?
Well, I think, there's one theme here, and we could pull these stories apart, but as you know in the show, want to talk about the authoritarian assault on our democracy. And I think that this story and the other story, as much as there's a hard coup, there are these more subtle ways of undoing how a democracy functions. And having truth out there is one of them. And if you destroy that, as they are so openly trying to do, that is part of the authoritarian assault on self-government. So when I mean, obviously the speaker must know that he's lying when he's making up this story about an FBI informant. He's
Or there's
engaged
a
in some kind of
germ of truth,
fantasy.
or there's a germ of truth, and he got in trouble
Or-
for saying it. We never know.
yeah.
Like maybe it is true, but they don't want us to know because Trump was forced to be an informant, right? That's the only. I mean, I'm writing my own movie here, I know, but still, I mean, I can't believe as insulated from reality and decency as Mike Johnson is that he would tell such a blatantly stupid lie unless he was quite confident the right-wing media ecosystem won't care.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, underneath all this awfulness, that in this element there is some truth because coming up, being forced to come up with such a QAnon style ridiculous lie is a desperate attempt to put that wall back, to recreate the reality in which Trump is a hero and that he's not a criminal president. This isn't a criminal presidency. And he wasn't essentially great friends with one of the worst sex criminals of the last 100 years. And yet he was. And that's the reality that's seeping through. So the fact that he needs to be so desperate, I find some hope in that, as awful as the moment is.
One of the greatest pedophile, greatest people are saying he's the greatest pedophile we've ever seen. Hey, people are crazy, sir. I mean, Corey, in your view, how should Congress, how should the courts, how should the press be handling new evidence like this card? What is the constitutional responsibility when
Uh,
corruption intersects with sexual exploitation of kids?
The Constitution begins with three words, we the people. And part of that, part of the idea of the First Amendment guarantee to free speech, is that the people have to be informed to make a decision about the most powerful leaders, including the President of the United States. And so my understanding is that the House Democrats had a role, the Democrats in Congress had a role in releasing this information and pushing for it. And that shows the importance of having not just a presence in the Congress, but taking it back, because the oversight of the Congress over the executive branch has largely been eviscerated with a few exceptions. And yet what we need is transparency. It's one of the most important mechanisms when we talk about checks and balances, is the American people knowing the truth. And this is a small example of it. And I think we're going to get so much more when we get a Democratic majority in both houses. It's not a guarantee, but if we can get it, it will be a real check because we'll start to hear the reality, that truth commission that you and I have talked about so often, of what's been happening, the ICE raids, who the policies are, the orders to disregard judges, and of course Trump's own criminality, not just in regard to Epstein, but the corruption, the creation of a mem coin to basically steal money from the American people, the use of his properties to profit, as he did during the first term with that hotel in Washington, D.C., the deals that we don't know about that he's corruptly made, I'm sure, with foreign governments to benefit himself and his family. Those are the kind of things that we're going to learn about. And even if impeachment and removal is not possible, impeachment in the first term, those two impeachments, were so important because of what they revealed about Trump's
Correct.
criminality, including the impeachment in the case of January 6th.
Absolutely. And I mean, if only they'd impeached him for the 10 counts of obstruction. Robert Mueller gift wrapped and handed them, but those Democrats were busy that day. I just want to say Mike Johnson told a lie about the FBI that was so stupid, even Kash Patel wouldn't help him. All right. Like, I mean, Trump was an informant. That's like saying Ronald McDonald was a vegan spy at Burger King. Trump couldn't infiltrate a Chuck E. Cheese ball pit. But it just seems like you're right, Corey. They don't want accountability because this Epstein scandal is not just a one man story. It is this whole system of powerful, rich creeps who'd rather burn evidence than face it. Which is an awkward segue to the Federal Trade Commission. But I wanted to start with the sexy stuff first because in the midst of all of this, the court just cleared the way for Trump to fire a Biden appointed FTC commissioner. Now, a lot of people are saying, oh, yet another victory for the unitary executive theory, which I guess we need to explain that again and why it matters so much to American democracy. But also, why is this bad, Corey? How does this decision threaten the independence of agencies like the FTC, the SEC, the Federal Reserve?
Look, some of what we're covering is kind of the face of the hard coup, the use of the military. Some of it is the kind of obvious example or way into Trump's criminality, the Epstein story. But to my mind, as important, maybe more important in this coup, this attempted authoritarian takeover of the United States, is the way that the mechanisms of power and restraint on power are being undermined. And I just have to, kind of, for those who are new to this, I'll introduce it. And for those who are coming back, you've gotten a deep lesson in it. It's a core part of constitutional law. And frankly, before Trump, it used to make people's eyes glaze over the
Yeah,
story of Humphrey's executor and how it's relevant here. But there is a case that protects us against federal abuse of power. And it's a case involving the firing during the FDR administration of the head of the Federal Trade Commission. What Congress had done there, and it's done it in a number of other instances, is it created an independent agency. The Federal Trade Commission's work, the idea of Congress was it's so important that we're going to protect the head of it from arbitrary firing for political reasons. And it's part of a pattern that goes back to the 1800s of protecting civil servants from
right.
political firings. But what this administration is trying to do, and this isn't new, it really is a desire that goes back to Ronald Reagan, is to shut off any of the limits on the president's control over the executive branch. Now, people don't
You're right.
realize this, but the executive branch is more than 2 million people. And if Trump could control all 2 million to use them for his own purposes, the authoritarian possibilities are endless. The way things are set up now is most of these people, the civil servants, the independent agencies, are charged with carrying out the law, and they're protected from firing unless they do something wrong, unless there's cause. And Trump is trying to wipe away all of that. And as the court did in that horrible opinion that we began with, doing away with the ban on racial discrimination, they might do away with all these protections that have been so hard fought for, and basically turn Trump into somebody who has the ability to control the entire federal bureaucracy, the entire 2 million people, to turn them from a group that are supposed to enforce the law to simply doing his own bidding. And we're not far from that. The Supreme Court, the bottom line is, might give him the power, in this case, the firing of the Federal Trade Commission member, because it is the same agency that the court used originally to limit the president's power.
Corey, I'm looking at these three cases we've been talking about: racial profiling and immigration raids, unitary executive and the firing of commissioners, illegal troop deployment in cities. I mean, do you see a coherent project by this court to expand presidential power at the expense of any constitutional protections? I mean, they really seem to be working for one guy, and I have a hard time believing they'd be hustling this hard for President Barack Obama.
No, I think that, what's going on, the unitary executive theory began during the Reagan era, where they trusted Reagan and wanted to empower him. And Reagan was no Trump, so there was something kind of naive but benign about that. But now that benign instinct has just taken such a dark turn, because you have a majority of the court seeing what Trump is doing, seeing his authoritarian ambitions, seeing his criminality. And through the immunity case, through this racial profiling case, through this undermining of the
Acceptable to
protection,
them.
they are head on handing over the destruction of liberal democracy, of our Constitution to this
He had
president. That's
cops
the
beaten
project.
for a lie, and he pardoned the Camp Auschwitz dude, and they can't stop capitulating to him. I mean,
Right.
that's
Right.
that's their
In
creed.
fact, I'd even go further, John. I think that's a good way to put it. They're often capitulating, but now it's taken a turn where I'd say it's not just capitulation, it's they're head on aiding him in the
Yeah.
hard coup and soft coup.
That's why the Heritage Foundation hired them. Hey,
Looks like
we got to take a quick break. When we come back, we're talking about my book, Professor. You're gonna make
oh,
me
I'm going
go.
to interview you. We're going to get into it. It's
Oh my
launch day,
God.
the birthday of separation of church and hate. I can't wait.
All right, we'll be right back. And Corey, I'll be Gentile with you. Don't go away. This is the Oath in the Office.
Welcome back to the Oath in the Office. I'm Corey Brettschneider. It's my pleasure today to reverse roles with my co-host John Fugelsang and begin to interview him. We began that process last week, and we'll continue it in depth today. And today, that we're recording this on September 9th, it's an amazing day because it's launch day of John's terrific book, important book. And I just want to read the title again. It's a brilliant title: Separation of Church and Hate, a sane person's guide to taking back the Bible from fundamentalists, fascists, and flock fleecing frauds. There's so much to praise about this book. I'll begin with the title and especially the subtitle. It really is a brilliant work. And for those who didn't listen last week, I'll introduce it by saying so often Christianity has been commandeered by Christian nationalism and by the right wing. And this is really a brilliant attempt, a careful attempt by looking at the text of the Christian Bible, of the life and teachings of Jesus, to reclaim Christianity for a much more progressive vision. And so let's get into it, John. I want to begin by just asking you a question about the text and the way the text is often used. And I think, unfortunately, in the media environment, Christian right-wing thinkers, Christian nationalists have been winning this argument, and you are essentially taking it on. And it says, look, if you look in the Bible, and we'll just start with one very common example, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Bible makes it very clear that Christianity condemns homosexuality, gay,
they
doesn't have room for gay rights. That's
they
the way.
argue that, yeah.
And so you've heard that a million times. So tell us, how does the book respond on that point in particular?
I'd love to. It's one of my favorite stories. Most people don't actually know the real story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It doesn't find its way into too many Bible coloring books. And as you know, for most of us, if we don't learn the stories when we're kids, we leave it behind. And for many of us, religion is putting up a tree in our house once a year and hating the minorities we're told it's okay to hate. Um, Sodom and Gomorrah is one of the most twisted stories in the Bible. It's where we get the term sodomy, which refers to a disgusting, unholy act engaged in by gay men with gay men, or straight men with amazing, wonderful, awesome, spectacular women. And in the story, it takes place shortly after Abraham has elegantly begged God to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. They're right beside each other, and they're like these two evil cities. It's like an even more depraved Minneapolis, St. Paul. They're horrible people. They're animal sacrifice and torture and stealing, and they use speakerphone in public. I mean, they don't pick up after their dogs. Just awful people, right? So God wants to destroy the city. Abraham elegantly talks God out of it by getting God to agree if there's just one good person in a city, he won't destroy it, which is God's way of saying he's not really into judging entire groups of people based on the actions of one or two. But
Mm.
then God sends two messengers down. They're angels. They're called messengers, and they show up. And Abraham's nephew Lot greets them and brings them into his house. And the angels are saying, "Look, y'all, God's going to drop the hammer on this thing. You better get out of here. Shit's about to jump off." I paraphrase from the Hebrew. While they're in there talking to him, this crowd gathers outside of guys, and they start yelling in, "Who are those two men in there with you? Throw them out here to us that we may know them." And if you've seen Oz season 2, you know exactly what they're talking about. Lot comes out and says, "No, gentlemen, please." Now, again, this is the story that gay men are bad, right? Lot comes out and says, "No, gentlemen, please don't gang rape these two angels. Here are my two daughters. They're virgins. Why don't, this is the hero of the story. He says, why don't y'all gang rape the two girls instead?" Rape is not about desire or passion. Rape's about power. And the men say, "No, no, we want to rape those two guys. Throw them out here." So the angels step out, they blind the crowd with some Hogwarts stuff. Lot and his family escape. God rains down fire and brimstone upon the unrepentant city. Lot's wife turns around to see the devastation, and for this transgression is turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters escape, and they go on to, the daughters decide to get their father drunk 2 nights in a row, have sex with their father, and then they give birth to their own sibling babies. And the moral of this story, we are taught, is that Neil Patrick Harris is a bad man. Now, there's nothing in the story about being gay. Rape is not about being gay. And if you think gang rape is the same as consensual, loving relationships, then homophobe, you're dating the wrong guys. But it didn't matter. The story stuck. And sodomy, Sodom itself came to refer to any kind of copulation that's not vaginal, meant for procreation. So it's been thousands of years of a minority that Jesus commands his followers to love, to treat the same way you treat him. But fundamentalists aren't interested in following Jesus. They want to worship him, they want to fight for him, they don't want to listen to him. They don't do anything the character says. So we've had thousands of years of this homophobia from deliberately twisting the scripture. I mean, if you're going to say that that story is anti-gay, then you've got to assume that God's okay with having sex and babies with your dad and gang raping angels, because those punishments are never, those behaviors are never punished or criticized. And I just got tired of seeing my mom and dad's religion my whole life being used to justify so much cruelty. The first issue that radicalized me as a kid was the death penalty, but LGBTQ equality was second, because you literally cannot be a homophobe and claim to follow this Jewish faith healer from Nazareth. You can't. It's not compatible. But for thousands of years, we have this, it's in the Bible somewhere mentality, this spiritual laziness coupled with narcissism that makes people think, well, Paul's letter to Galatians carries just as much. If Jesus won't condemn the immigrants, I'll find something in Paul. And it's
Yeah.
blasphemous. It's just picking and choosing the Bible to go ahead and satisfy your prejudices. But Christians aren't supposed to follow the Bible. Christians are
Yeah.
supposed to follow Christ. So you don't need to believe any of the Bible as literal fact to use it to call out these people, because as we've discussed, Professor, it's not just that they're getting the religion wrong. They're trying to force their mean, narrow, anti Jesus, right wing version of Christianity onto our society, into our culture, into our public schools. And we can't hate these people, but we got to beat them. And
Yeah.
this book is a guide to take to debate the Christian fundamentalist in your life and your job and your family and your government.
I had a favorite teacher in graduate school, George Kateb, actually a brilliant political philosopher, and he used to say, "Even the devil can quote scripture." And that was one of his favorite quotes. And you often
That's
hear from
Hamlet.
your
That's
opponents,
Hamlet.
right, paraphrasing Shakespeare, that you hear these quotes or references or citations, and then what's so brilliant about the book is that you say, well, let's actually look at the story and let's think about it. And what we talked about last time is the idea of literalism, and part of what the book is doing is saying too, you have to be careful not just to read it, but to read it for its meaning and read the stories for its meaning. I thought that was a great discussion, a kind of
Thank you.
relevant part, I think, follow up to that. And the book does two things. It gives you the details of how to argue about the substance of the issues before us, like abortion or
It
feminism
has
or
all
gay
the right
rights.
wing arguments on all these topics and why they're against this Bible they wave around like a prop.
Yeah. But what I wanted to ask too is more about the philosophy. We talked about literalism last time, but one thing I
Yeah.
found fascinating was your recognition that so much of Christian nationalism relies on a kind of certainty, and that certainty is itself something that we have to be leery of. So can you say more about that? What is the role of certainty in
Yeah.
culture and in Christian nationalism, and how can we, as people who want to embrace a more full view of Christianity or other religions, to sort of avoid that mistake?
What a great question. I mean, I'm sure many of our listeners have had this experience in their own evolution. Um, I don't think I don't think that the opposite of faith is doubt. I think doubt is an important part of faith. You have to have doubt to go through it and see if you really have faith. The opposite of faith is certainty, not believing, knowing, knowing that God likes you better because you were in the right unauthorized God fan club. And to me, this is the essence of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism is what is ruining all the world's great religions. The far right wing, the extreme conservative wing of all the world's religions is why people don't like religion. I don't know if we talked about this last week on the show, but fundamentalists don't think they're better than you. They know that God thinks they're better than you. And we've all known people who were so certain, this lethal, dangerous certainty that you can't really do anything wrong because anyone who opposes me is on the side of Satan. I represent God. So, God hates the same people I hate. This narcissistic spiritual laziness that we see happening all across Islam, all across Christianity, all across Judaism. And, you know, the fundamentalists, the more to the right your religion is, the more women are always second class citizens. Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, the more conservative, the more God made half the world's population unfit to lead, the more sex is bad for women or gay people. If you're not doing it for procreation, shouldn't be enjoying that. The more conservative your religion is, the more you'll believe that violence is okay if my side does it, because we're on the side of the one true God. Number four, every fundamentalist wing of every religion focuses more on punishment than on healing. And finally, they all have this penchant for victimhood, this persecution narrative that justifies anything cruel or that goes against our holy book. In fact, we're allowed to go against what the holy book says because someone else was bad to us one time. You mix these five traits together, and right-wing Christians have more in common with right-wing Muslims than they have with moderate Christians. So this book is for anybody of any belief system, atheist, any religion, agnostic, anyone who's going to have to deal with one of these people, because they use this Bible as camouflage, and the media is never going to ask tough follow-up questions. I learned this in all my years working in cable news. Tough follow-up questions means we don't get the booking back. So no one ever says to Mike Pence, "Hey, where did Jesus drive the gay wedding cakes out of the temple exactly? Where have you ever seen a media figure ask a conservative politician, where does Jesus Christ say being gay is bad? Where does Jesus Christ say abortion is a sin? Where does Jesus Christ say to call the Christian refugees illegals and repel them at the border? We waste our time arguing with these people. Make them argue with God. Make them argue with Jesus. The God of the Hebrew Scriptures commands the Israelites to welcome the stranger, to treat the alien as one of your own. Jesus goes a step further in Matthew 25, saying individuals and nations will be judged on how they welcome the stranger. So instead of calling your racist uncle a racist bigot, why not say, well, why are God and Jesus wrong, but Donald Trump and you are right? Make them argue against the Bible, not you.
Right. I mean, I can imagine, part of the book's power is in giving us ways to argue with Christian nationalism, also to think philosophically about things like how to read in the first place a religious text literally or in a deeper way, as you've been arguing, and also this sort of profound idea of really how to approach the world and politics without the sort of narrow certainty that you often see from Christian nationalists and from the right.
You're right.
There are, I imagine, even from sympathetic listeners who haven't read the book and from those who are beginning the book, I imagine coming into it, a lot of them will have some questions that I want to ask you about and that you do respond to in the book. But for those who haven't read it yet, and they
Thank you.
haven't read it because it's come out today, I
I
think
mean,
that,
I didn't, I didn't really write it just for liberal Christians. I mean, I
yeah,
wrote it for, I try to bring the atheists and the conservative Christians along in every chapter. I try to check in with them and make sure they're
exactly.
okay.
And so, I mean, so I'm just imagining what somebody coming, for instance, an atheist coming to this, who's also a feminist might ask, and you address this, but I want to set this up for listeners and those watching it. You know, you have this brilliant way of phrasing the chapter titles in terms of commandments themselves that seem to not be the usual way that we think about it. And I want to ask you about the one, thou shalt not hate feminism. And the kind of argument that you make really for a feminist reading of the Bible itself. So what do you say to those who have used the Bible to try to defend uh, um, uh, uh, misogynistic,
Yeah.
male supremacist way of seeing the world? And then you could imagine too, I invite you too to think about the texts in the Bible that you talk about that seem like they might cut against feminism. For instance, one of the commandments about not coveting another's wife, that sounds like a property conception
That
of,
was very much property. Women are property in
yeah.
the Bible. Yeah. I mean,
And
the
so
women, I
how do
point out,
you,
women fall into two categories,
yeah.
property and or icky.
So
Uh,
how do you respond to that? I mean, how might a feminist
yeah.
approach to the world and to the Bible and to religion? I mean, what do you say to those right-wing Christian nationalists who the trad wife movement who say, "Hey, this is all
Yeah.
grounded in the
I'm so
Bible"?
glad
What's
you
the way
asked
to
that.
argue with them?
The feminism chapter, I got to be honest with you. It was one of those things where I thought, okay, I have to do a chapter on feminism. You know, for space, I cut my whole chapter out about the rapture. I cut my whole chapter out about the war on Christmas. There wasn't room for it. But the feminism chapter was the one that I learned the most.
Mm,
Like so many biblical stories they teach you when you're kids before you understand why they matter and why Jesus was a threat to the establishment. And my first editor actually made me move the feminism chapter to the front of the book instead of towards the back where I had it. And I was happy to. Look, if God loves men and women equally, then God's a feminist. All right. That's it. That's it. I mean, that's what feminism is. I am not a feminist. I'm a female supremacist. I think the Y chromosome is proof of damaged goods and women are superior. So I don't believe in equality. I think women are better. So I am biased. Um, Women have it really rough in the Bible. And before I go into this, let me say the Jews have come so far and are so ahead of the Christians now. They had Golda Meir as a leader for Israel, and by God, 250 years, we're still trying to get one. We elected one woman in 2016, but weren't able to have her as president. So, you know, Jews are so far ahead of us with women's rights and with women serving in the military. But if you look in the Bible, and if you want to believe in this, you'll see the Bible. It's like the gospel according to Ike Turner. Women are property; they are owned by a man. If a woman is raped and she's a virgin, she has to marry the rapist because that's property rights. If a woman is not married on her wedding night, the entire town of men have to get together and stone her to death. Women are property. It was strategic. How can I make my family stronger by bonding with another family? There wasn't really anything like premarital sex because most girls were married off like the Virgin Mary at 12 or 13 or 14. And women have no property rights. When a man no longer delights in his wife, he can just kick her to the curb. That's how divorce worked. Uh, Menstruation, which gives us life, menstrual blood, which is the foundation of life, was considered a disgusting thing. And women who were menstruating were separated. If you have a baby, you're unclean in the eyes of God. If it's a female baby, you're unclean for twice as long. If you touch something a menstruating woman touched, you're unclean in the eyes of God. They're very thorough here. And then you got this Jesus coming along, and in fact, at one point in the Bible, I have in the book, I have a segment called "The Biblical Slut Shaming Hall of Fame" for women who have been unfairly tarnished by Scripture and history. Then Jesus comes along, and there's many great female heroes throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, ingenious women who figure out how to rise above their station. Jesus comes along and breaks all this down. He breaks the laws of his faith. He teaches women, which was completely forgiven. He talks to women, which you weren't allowed to do, including women from different religions. He was breaking the law talking to that Samaritan woman. He never judges any woman for their sex life ever, not even close. He allows women to touch him, which was also strictly forbidden. Matthew 19 is a verse they like to use to say that gay marriage is wrong, where Jesus tells the Pharisees, male and female, he made them. A man will cling to his wife. There you go. Jesus said it. When you actually read Matthew 19 in context, what it is Jesus coming out and saying that the divorce laws of Moses are really messed up. He says, your hearts were hardened. Because again, a guy could just kick his wife to the curb. And women couldn't get jobs back then. They couldn't go to school. If you didn't
mm,
have family to take you in, your options were prostitution or begging as a homeless person. That's what happened to women. So they come to Jesus and they say, "Hey, we got this, the divorce law," and Jesus changes it. He overturns Hebrew law constantly. I mean, death penalty and Sabbath observance. He challenges it so many times, and he says, "If you dump your wife for any reason other than she cheated on you, you're an adulterer, and you're turning her into an adulterer." This totally freaks out the apostles. They're like, "Wait, we can never dump our wives? Maybe it's better to not get married." But Jesus lays it out. So the story they use to say that gay marriage is against Jesus is
mm.
really Jesus coming out against heterosexual divorce. And these people support Donald Trump. So again, Mike Huckabee uses this all the time. I've never seen a journalist call him out and say,
Mm.
that's anti straight divorce. You ready to condemn Donald Trump? Ready to condemn Ronald Reagan for dumping their wives? Turn it back on them. Make them argue against Jesus. I, I, I gotta say, I mean, I learned so much about why he was revolutionary. Really quick, the bleeding lady story. Sam Cooke did a great song about it. She was bleeding 12 years. That made her extra icky. She couldn't go out of the house. She was unclean. They tried all treatments, nothing could work. She heard Jesus was coming. This is the gospel song, Touch the Hem of His Garment. She believed if she touched his clothing, she'd be healed. She works her way through the crowd, which was illegal. She wasn't supposed to be around people. The law said she was unclean. So she made everyone in that crowd unclean in the eyes of God because she was bleeding out of her hoo ha. How dare she go in public? She walks up behind Jesus, touches Jesus, makes him unclean. He feels something's happened. The power's gone out of him. And she says, it was me. I'm sorry, it was me. And Jesus says to her, daughter, you are healed. Now, it's the one time in the Bible he ever calls anyone daughter. And he said it to a ritually unclean woman who had just broken the law to make him unclean in the eyes of God. This woman violated the taboo. Jesus broke it for good. It's amazing right wing men pretend they follow this guy, Corey.
Well, I mean, this has been a tour de force of thinking, what I like about it too, John, is that you don't hide from the parts of the Bible that seem to endorse anti-feminism,
Oh,
misogyny, the
plenty
idea
of it,
of
plenty
women.
of it. That well, as soon as Jesus dies, Paul takes over. Paul pours all
Yeah,
of his misogyny. I mean, Mary Magdalene wasn't a prostitute, but she was one of the investors in Jesus's movement.
yeah,
Women were the executive. How these 13 guys walk around and eat? Because women were financing it. Were you ever taught that? I was never
yeah,
taught that in school. Jesus dies. Paul comes, and again, when he comes back, if you believe that part of the story, the women are the first people he appears to. The women were the only ones who didn't abandon Jesus. And
yeah.
then Paul comes in, brings his misogyny. Paul doesn't think women should be able to speak in church. Paul thinks women should submit to men in all areas. And so Paul's misogyny was a lot more comfortable for the men setting up the early church than Jesus's feminism. The weird part about that is, in other Paul letters, he talks about these women who are deacons who saved his life. How are you going to say a woman's a deacon in the church in one letter and that women can't talk in church in another letter? It's almost like different people wrote these letters or they
Yeah.
were intended for different audiences because Paul's whole thing was marketing.
I mean, it's not surprising to you that as we conclude the interview, that I've got to ask you and bring it back to the Constitution. I'm going to ask you about the founders and their version of Christianity. Talk about that, their version and understanding of religion. But I do want to make just a general comment, and before we get into that, and ask you. I was asked by actually a former student of mine who's now a professor at Harvard Divinity School to participate in a conversation in a church in Greenwich Village about
Wow.
the analogy between interpreting the Constitution and biblical interpretation. So he paired me with a number of Bible scholars, and our
One of my
conversation
favorite subjects.
today reminds me of that. So yeah, I'd love to include you in that.
I
Uh,
mean, Corey, could I just say, look at Jesus and Lincoln, killed by John Wilkes Booth. I mean, both of these
yeah.
guys had their operations taken over by the people who killed him, the Romans and the Confederates.
Yeah, and I guess one thing that came out of that conversation was, as you're talking about, the idea of biblical literalism cuts off an entire way of thinking about the principles of Christianity, the biblical
Yeah,
principles that are embedded. And we see that so often in the law, this attempt of a narrow kind of textualism in the Second Amendment, limiting the wider understanding of what a liberal democracy is supposed to do when it comes
that's
to
right.
reasonable regulation of guns, or the way in which the text can be read so narrowly to create an idea of color blindness, when the whole purpose of the Equal Protection Clause, as we talked about in the beginning, was anti-subordination, to get rid of not just slavery but the vestiges of
That's right.
slavery. So we'll continue on those themes, and well, I mean, I guess I'll just ask, any thoughts about that, more about the sort of analogy between reading the Constitution and reading um, the Bible? We've had so many conversations over years on Sirius XM, and over 6 months on The Oath in the Office. So I'll just ask you if you have any thoughts about that, if you have any lessons in writing this book and fighting back against religious fundamentalism as we
Yeah.
fight back against the kind of textual fundamentalism in constitutional law.
I mean, it's something I think about all the time, and we've talked about it a lot, Professor. Obviously, in looking at, how do I say this? Okay, our right-wing friends will say, well, Jesus tells us to help the poor and take care of the sick. He never says government should force us to do it, right? There's a government should for it. We do it, not government. The founders got a lot of things wrong. And of course, I would not call them Jesus followers. If you own people, you have forfeited the right to ever pretend you're a follower of Jesus.
Mm.
If you are ethnic cleansing the indigenous people, you have forfeited the right to ever claim you follow Jesus. And I go through all the different biblical rationales people used at the time, but the founders got one thing right, that the government should not be able to tell you how to pray, when to pray, who to pray to, or if you even should pray. And that our official religion in this country is all and or none. They were deists. They thought that God was sort of like the CEO who set up the company, but he's not going to show up for the Zoom meetings. You know, he's there, but he's we're running it now. There's natural laws that govern the universe, and God set us up just fine. They were not believing in miracles. They didn't care about that stuff at all. And one of the parts of the book I had to cut out was a whole, I went really deep on the founders and the Treaty of Tripoli, which has always meant a lot to me. Article 11, ratified by George Washington, signed by Thomas Jefferson, which said the government of the United States is in no way founded on the Christian religion. You know it, along with the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. These guys wrote it down more than once. Barbary pirates were attacking our ships and stealing merchandise. They were Muslim. We called them muscle men back then. And the new American nation knew that if we were an official religious nation, it's going to be really hard for capitalism. We do a lot better doing capitalism around the globe if we can tell all those different international trading partners, oh, we're not any official religion. We're here to do business. America's prosperity helped grow because we weren't trying to pretend we were a Christian nation. Now, I got no problem with anybody who wants to have a government based on the values of Christ. When has the Republican Party in the last 50 years ever been, when since Nixon and the earned income tax credit? I ask this all the time, Corey. Give me one teaching of Jesus that Donald Trump and Republicans fight for. They can't do it. You'll just know how little they read the book. But it comes down to this new covenant where Jesus says, I have a new set of rules, which means you can't use Old Testament law to be cruel to gay people because Christians are supposed to follow Christ, not the Bible. And as I began by saying, it's in Matthew 25 where he gives his marching orders. At the end of the world, he says, I'm going to gather individuals and nations. And he says, you're going to be judged by how you take care of the poor, take care of the sick, welcome the stranger, and how kind you are to those in jail. That's it. That's Jesus explaining what a Christian nation would have to be, not how loudly you scream at women outside clinics or how mean you are to transgender children who want to play sports, not how much money you give your church or how loudly you boast about how loudly you pray. Take care of the poor, take care of the sick, be kind to prisoners, and welcome the stranger. It's like Jesus's memo to the Heritage Foundation. So, if we're talking about a government based on religious values, based on Christian values, these are the values of Christ. And by the way, they're all good for the economy. They're all good. Taking care of poor people and sick people, that helps billionaires. Welcoming the stranger, we're going to need to do that because we're not making enough babies. And these Gen Xers are going to get old and they're going to need some immigrants to feed them and put their diapers on in the old age home. I mean, literally, it's a design for government. And they still want to say, no, Jesus said do it all privately. No, he didn't. Jesus opposed the death penalty, never mentioned abortion. So say to your right wing uncle, if you support killing sinners, which Jesus opposed, but you're violently against abortion, which Jesus and Moses and Paul and all the prophets and God and the entire book never bans, we're not obliged to take your claims of Christianity seriously anymore. You're following what conservative Christians want. And conservative Christians don't care about the teachings of Christ. They care about power. Donald Trump seduced them, Corey, not by promising to be Jesus like, but promising to put you first, to give you power, to stop all of this persecution you receive. And they're not persecuted, Professor. We've talked about it. Not letting you teach talking snakes in science class, not letting you
Mm.
be mean to gay people. None of this threatens conservative religious practice, just conservative religious domination. So much I've learned about the law from you that I brought into this book to show how it's really easy to manipulate the law and pick and choose when you're not really sure which one you're supposed to follow.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to the book that are extremely helpful and that really resonate with the values that we've been talking about on the podcast for so long. One is that, there's a kind of lie that gets told by Christian nationalists that this is the true Christianity, that their true Christianity is bigotry, that it's misogyny, that it's anti-gay. And you rescue Christianity certainly from that reading. That's one of the powers of the book. And you do it not just by talking about the text, which you take seriously, but by talking about the values, the same way we try to do in talking about the Constitution. And
Thank
then
you.
I think you also, there's a sort of, I mean, I think that alone is well worth more than the price of admission. But then there's another thing that the book is doing, and you were really getting to that in your last answer, which is it's providing a way for people, of course, outside Christianity, and you're addressing the book not just to Christians, but to non-believers too, who want to learn about this way of thinking, but to converge with other ways of thinking on progressive and liberal values of
Yeah.
when I say liberal again, the values of liberal democracy is what I mean. The idea of equal protection, not in this narrow, awful, pretend sense of colorblindness, but in resisting subordination and
Yeah.
making a role for all people, regardless of sexual orientation.
That's Jesus.
And not, of course, finding a place for women as equals within a society, and a society too that's humane when it comes to economic well-being and not cruel. And it's both, providing a rebuttal to those who would steal Christianity and would steal our liberal democracy from us, and also a bridge to those who will have a different faith-based way of coming to these principles, or a secular way
Oh,
of doing so. So it's
thank
really
you.
an amazing book, John, and I
Well,
thank you
Corey,
for writing it and for
I've
doing this show.
thank you. I mean, I've learned so much from you, Professor. And these people are using this book, they are weaponizing this book to change our laws, to change our governance. They are weaponizing this book to force their very narrow right-wing version of Christianity onto this country. And they get away with this by wrapping themselves up in this book and pretending that's a virtue.
Right.
These are fascists who hate democracy, and they use the Bible as camouflage. This is a guide to camouflage removal. These
Yeah.
guys will not get to hide behind scripture. We can't let them do it. The media cowers before this, and the Democratic Party has completely ceded the issue of spirituality over to the right the way they ceded the flag. I'm tired of it. Everywhere I go, I talk to so many people, believers or not, who were raised this way, and they can't believe this is what passes for Christianity in this country. The war's not going to be won by the media asking tough questions or the Democrats fighting back. Look at how many of us have talked parents and grandparents out of so much homophobia in the last 30 years. I really believe it's possible. I think you get a lot farther convincing your uncle that Jesus was not an immigrant hating homophobe by showing him that in the book than if you just call your uncle an immigrant hating homophobe. They're not on the side of the Bible, and you don't have to like them, but I don't think we can hate them. We have to beat them. And liberals, including atheists and moderates, need to start using the Bible against these people because they use it for scurrilous means. They don't follow Leviticus, but they'll weaponize parts they don't believe in to hurt other people. If you're not stoning Donald Trump to death for adultery, as Leviticus 20:10 demands, you don't get to condemn the gays because Leviticus 18 says you shall not lie with a man as with a man. They don't believe the very book they use, Professor. And so they get away with it because we don't fight back. We just call them superstitious. We don't know the scripture. I'm tired of that. We got to crush this movement because it is bad for religion and it's bad for democracy.
Well, thanks for writing it, John. I urge people to read Separation of Church and Hate. It's a brilliant read. Of course, as you know from listening to John on the show and other shows, it's both brilliant, interesting, well argued, but also funny at the same
Thank you.
time. Not an easy combination to pull off.
Thank
And
you.
congrats on the early success. As you know, I'm tracking it and seeing its
I'm
sales
doing okay, right?
numbers.
I
It
turn to
looks
you
like
for this.
it's, I don't want to jinx it, but it's heading in what looks to me like bestseller territory, and certainly it deserves, whether it makes that New York Times list or not, it deserves to be on it. And thanks for writing it, and thanks for
Thank
doing the
you.
show, and thanks to the listeners for listening. Should we say goodbye to everybody,
Let's
urge
say
them to
goodbye, but
subscribe?
thank you all. Yeah, and I just hope, Corey, I can be banned in Alabama by Christmas. That's all I ask for. I just hope I can beat Kamala Harris with her. Boy, but did I pick the wrong time to release my book? For God's sakes. But thank you, Professor. Again, I appreciate you so much and what you bring into this world, and thank you for letting me talk about biblical law. for a bit. And I want to thank you for everything. And I want to tell everybody listening, we like to get your letters and notes, and you can write to us. But please subscribe, give us a good review, and tell your friends. And please share these episodes. Corey, what's the best way for our audience to follow you, sir, the other 6 days of the week?
Well, every so often, of course, we do listener questions, and I'm compiling them, and you could send them to me at corey.brettschneider@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at BrettschneiderC, and also on Blue Sky at Democracy Prof. And those reviews keep coming. We're well past 350 at this point. They're
Nice.
all 5 stars from what I can tell,
Nice.
and enthusiastic. And thanks for them. When you do those reviews, even a sentence or a word, it helps promote it through the famous algorithm. And we are growing like crazy. And especially the way that we grow is listeners using that share function, sending a link on email or
Right.
on their phone and text message. So keep doing it. And what a pleasure. And I think that, I'll end with a bit of hope that we've got some bad news from the court, certainly this week, but we've also got a lot of hope too that we've brought. And we've got hope too that can come from a lot of sources, including one that I'm learning a lot about, which is from Christianity.
Who knew? Let's say from Jesus, maybe not
Let's say
Christianity.
from Jesus, yeah.
The whole point of this book is that the whole history of the religion has been authoritarianism, and there is a great tradition of Christian activism, and it all comes in resistance to Christian authoritarianism. The protests against Columbus, the protests against the Crusades, the protests against the Spanish Inquisition, against slavery, against segregation. It's always been the people challenging the Christian orthodoxy by talking about Jesus. That's how Dr. King did it.
And I have to say too, I've mentioned this before, but I do want to mention as we say goodbye to the listeners that a lot of the people listening are family members of mine, in particular on my wife Allie's side of the family.
Yes, thank you.
Her grandfather was a noted liberal Christian theologian who would have totally loved this book. He was the dean of the Louisville Seminary before it was taken over by Baptist fundamentalists. He was a liberal Baptist, an ally, as we've talked about, of Martin Luther King, and you can hear in King's speeches, actually, in one of them, talking about my wife's grandfather. So this has a personal element for me. I should have said that too, in that you're really reviving a tradition that's close to our family, and in particular, that my wife's family has been a huge part of it. So thanks so much. My own book is dedicated to Allie's mom, who passed, Virginia Wise, and this was her father was the head of this seminary, and she spoke often about this idea of Christianity. So to see it in print and brought to life, it's been an amazing conversation, John, and an honor to know you. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
God bless you. Thank you, Corey, and thank your family for me. I hope they like it. And I just want to say to our listeners, on my podcast and Sirius XM show this week, we just taped a special with Governor Andy Bashir, who is most certainly going to be a presidential candidate. He is that anomaly, the Democrat who is very popular in a red state. We had a really deep dive about what Democrats nationally can learn from his model. And so you can hear that on the John Fugelsang podcast, or if you have Sirius XM, it's on demand, and we're going to be re-airing it all week. He's doing a series now with Sirius XM, and I think it's really great that national Democrats are actually doing progressive media and reaching out to the base. So thank you, Corey. I hope listeners will check that out, and I can't wait to see what we have to make sense of next week on The Oath in the Office.